Hello, my name is Hugh Paterson, and today's presentation is Metadata for Language Learning Resources, Advancement for Language Development. My co-authors are Phil Barker and Matthew Lee. I want to start off the conversation today thinking about broad categories for language resources. Broadly, I think in our field of language documentation and linguistics and language development, we can agree that there are undocumented, undescribed languages, or underdocumented and underdescribed languages. There are materials that are produced about a language in the context of language documentation. There are additional materials that are produced in the context of language description. Maybe those are grammars or more technical resources. And then there are resources that are produced to intentionally increase the use or the vitality of a language. And those are not necessarily the same thing as description, and also, again, not necessarily the same thing as evidentiary materials that are produced as part of language documentation. The primary difference I would categorize as being the intentionality behind them. So we could look at it this way too. We could look at the right-hand side of the chart there as language as object. In these cases, researchers or participants are looking at the materials produced where they're producing materials, but they're looking at the language as an object. Where on the right-hand side, the language, maybe objects exist, artifacts of effort or creative works exist, but they are produced as a language, and their view is language as instrument. So on the right-hand side, we might have evidence and analysis, whereas on the left-hand side, we might have orality and learning resources. So it's in this context of learning resources and language development that today's talk is situated, right? So by learning resources, I mean the materials that are used usually as part of curriculum. Maybe we're teaching about a language or a language. Maybe we're in a community context and we're teaching literacy. Maybe we're in a minority language context and we're teaching math or cultural heritage, ways of life, or geography or religion. These are often less esteemed works than, say, an academic journal article from the perspective of academics that are inside of university context. So, but I think that language resources ought to be archived, and part of that, the preserved record, for a couple of reasons. Social contexts are constantly changing. So if we want to do long-term research to understand language vitality through the lens of language revitalization efforts or language development efforts, then we need to understand what has been attempted in terms of intentional actions for increasing the social use of particular language. So the context change, political educational administrations can change, so orthographic revisions can change, changes in implementing technology. So if we're doing digital learning, if we talk about learning via language via computer 20 years ago, that's very different. And today, an iPad app may not work tomorrow. So what is the technology implementation of the learning theory and the learning activities? Changes to educational theory. Which educational theory prompted the creation of the curricula, or the conformity to government learning standards and goals? is important, and those are constantly evolving as well. So situating language resources inside of these contexts helps look and look at and evaluate the trajectory that has happened in various communities when we evaluate language vitality and language development. Now, what does all this have to do with OLAC or with the distribution of language resources? Well, OLAC is a Dublin Core application profile. So it's a way to distribute information about language resources, and it sits on top of the OLAC metadata for language resources. Is a refinement of the Dublin Core elements and the Dublin Core terms, which is then implemented through the OAI PMH protocol. So there are certain things in each of those layers that contribute to the total description of language resources. And now learning resources can also be language resources when they're learning resources about languages or for language communities in a language, right? As linguists, we get excited about the top part. But maybe I think some of the friends of linguists get excited about what might be considered the fringe part of OLAC, those things that are not directly OLAC refinements, but exist inside of Dublin Core or even OIPMH. So let's look at some of those that are kind of outside the periphery of OLAC, but still inside of the entire application profile that exists, right? So OLAC via Dublin Core inherits some things that are relevant to language resources. For instance, audience, mentor, instructional method, and the special relationship conforms too. Those are all in Dublin Core already and can be used to describe learning resources. MARC roles are available through the documentation of the OLAC application profile. Technical implementation may be another story, but there are some MARC roles that are definitely relevant to language resources. So we have the role of teacher, book designer, general designer, editor, illustrator, and programmer. And these are MARC roles that we can use today and should be available via the OLAC application profile. Now, audience is a special element, and it dictates and it talks to, like, what is this resource? Who is this resource for? Some sort of specialized audience. Maybe it's for students, maybe it's for teachers. A mediator is a entity that distributes or controls the distribution of a resource. And instructional methods, those seem to clearly go with learning resources. And conforms to can be a link to a standard or a component of a standard that is talking about learning objectives and learning goals. Now, I want to introduce another concept here. Now, this is what we get with Dublin Core. Another concept here is to use an outside vocabulary or a set of vocabularies with specific design intent for learning resources. So one of those is the Learning Resource Metadata Initiative, LRMI, and these are 4 of the 5 vocabularies in LRMI. So they allow for the description of language resources, but learning resources specifically, with more specificity. So I like to look at the type vocabulary and think about, when I do a lesson plan, I have an activity plan, I have assessments, I have an assessment item, I have educational curriculum guide that I might build for if I have a substitute teacher take my class, for example, or it might be provided to me by someone who wants me to implement their classroom plan. So there's lesson plans and physical learning resources and recorded lessons, supporting documents and textbooks, and a unit plan to pull it all together. So there are also, like, I like to look at roles too. There's administrators, general public, mentor, parent, peer tutor, professional, student, and teacher. So those can be the roles that are targeted by a resource. This is a resource for administrators. This is a resource for peer tutors. So, and then we could describe a learning resource by activity type and also educational use. When we look at this in a broad, like in a table format, right, there's some elements or some terms here that pull the whole thing together, really. So some of those use taxonomies, like I just showed you, 5 parts of it. And then other parts here are mapped directly to things that are already inside of the Dublin Core standard. So the work that we did was we compared LRMI and Dublin Core and said, where do they fit together? And what do we need in addition to implement LRMI through OLAC? So just as Dublin Core, OLAC refined some Dublin Core elements, we took LRMI and said, okay, let's mix that with the OLAC elements and put that inside the Dublin Core elements, and let's see how that works. Now, we had there are some engineering challenges because there's some differences of description methods, right? So the Dublin Core structure kind of looks like this. Every item just describes the resource, or at least that's the way many repositories approach it, right? And that means that we have something that looks like this. We have a resource on the left, and then it has a relationship to a descriptive element on the right. And then we might use qualified Dublin Core to say, and we're going to describe that relationship in a certain way, right? We're going to say that there's a creator of a product, and actually it's not just any type of creator, it's a special type of creator, it's an illustrator, right? And that gives us instead of that structure we saw in the last screen, it gives us a structure that looks a bit more like this. All right, so we have a relationship, and that relationship has a descriptor type and then a descriptor value. That's kind of what's being shown here. Now, the engineering idea behind LRMI is a little bit different. It looks a bit more like this. And basically what it means, we have a creative work, just what we did before, on the left. And then on the right, it relates to an alignment object. And the alignment object will then relate to several different components in the educational framework that it's trying to implement the training goals of. So now then some items in the LRMI directly describe the creative work. All right, so there's a couple of things in the big table that we saw before that are through this one, and then there are some that directly relate to creative work. So how do we do this? What's the technical layer of this, right? So just like OLAC does for Dublin Core inside of OAI syntax, we added an XSI type, and here you can see the subject, that there's 2 terms or 4 terms here that we use. So if it were a test, right, or an assessment tool, right, we could say that it's an assessment about something, right? So it's modifying the subject, or this resource intends to teach something, right? So the educational subject and LRMI, you can see in the blue there, that's the part that we added to the Dublin Core part. So some of these items could exist in different areas of the Dublin Core and makes sense. And so we mapped those there too, right? So we can use the Dublin Core namespace or the DC terms namespace, and this just kind of shows that you can use both of those. So this brings up a great engineering question that I think our community needs to address, is that when we're doing third-party extensions to Dublin Core or to OLAC, should the aggregator include new namespaces, or should OLAC application profile be expanded to include new terms? There's two different technical ways of adding functionality to the OLAC aggregator. But remember, whenever we do that, whichever path we take, the value add at the end of the day is in the visualization, which allows people to work with the embedded metadata from those resources or about those resources. And it's this awareness that will allow for new engagement in the area of language development and language revitalization. So you can see the technical work that we've been doing at this GitHub repo. Thank you, and we'll take your questions.